Hi, and welcome to our fourth asynchronous module for SLS 312. Today we are going to be continuing our discussion on the assessment of second language reading. And we're going to start by taking a look at three different purposes for assessing reading, and we can actually look a little more in depth at each purpose. The first purpose for using assessments in a second language reading course would be as a diagnostic tool. So often at the beginning of a course or before entering the language program, teachers will give some sort of reading diagnostic test, and the goal of the test would be to ascertain or to figure out what learners already know. And then the teacher would be able to design their course and select appropriate teaching materials for the group of students that they are working with. Sometimes diagnostic assessments are used as part of a larger needs analysis, and sometimes they're done simply on their own. There are also progress assessments, and we often want to evaluate how students' reading ability or literacy skills are developing and moving along toward our target, or maybe it could be their target. These assessments are often informal, but they can be formal. So you may have tests or quizzes. Sometimes, though, teachers prefer to use reading journal entries, classroom discussions, reflections. For example, in this course, your reflected journals are a way for me to assess your engagement with course content and our course texts. Hedgecock and Ferris state that this evidence, often described as formative assessment, should offer students ongoing feedback on their progress while supplying teachers with information about the effectiveness of their instruction. So often progress assessments work for both the teachers and the students. They help the teachers to understand how far their students have come, and also then to readjust instruction if the students are not making the progress that they would like. And students as well could gain some confidence in the fact that their abilities are increasing, and also just to get a sense of, again, where they've come from and what they have left to accomplish. Achievement assessments are often done at the end of a term or a particular class, and they usually involve some sort of summative or final evaluation. These achievement assessments involve development of an assessment plan that articulates precisely how grades or marks will be assigned in line with curricular goals and standards. Moving forward, I want to briefly introduce or review for you three terms that may come up in our discussion of assessing reading, and that will likely return when we go to when we take a deeper look at how to assess writing. So Brown, 2004, states that a test is a method for measuring a person's ability, knowledge, or performance in a given domain. Hedgecock and Ferris would say that a test is a way to elicit a measurable performance from learners from which we can draw appropriate inferences about examinees' underlying competence as readers. In other ways, when we try to test reading, what we're really doing is we are asking students to complete some sort of task, to complete some sort of measure, from which we're hoping to get a sense of sort of this underlying competence, this underlying ability to read. Since we don't yet have a way to get into students' heads and to directly test what they are understanding or what they're able to comprehend from their reading, most tests or assessments of reading are generally some sort of performance that we are assuming is evidence of their underlying ability. You may also hear researchers distinguish between direct tests of reading and indirect tests. Again, we can't actually test reading in a second language directly because we can't get into our students' heads. However, in a so-called direct test of reading, ideally the learner is involved in actually reading. So there is some sort of text to read, and then what the test developer or teacher asks the learner to do with that text can vary, but they do need to be involved in reading. An indirect test of reading would be a test that examines some sort of process or performance which is thought to be related to reading. So for example, if you take a vocabulary test in a language course or in a reading course, teachers or sometimes test developers may take that performance, your performance on that vocabulary test, as some sort of indication of your ability to read. If you think, for example, of the SAT or the GRE or the TOEFL reading section, if you've taken those tests, some of the questions, yes, they engage you in actually, some of the verbal questions engage you in reading and responding to questions, but there are other questions related to vocabulary and sentence structure that somehow contribute to what they assume to be an explanation or of sort of performance of your overall verbal ability. Okay. All right, moving forward, reliability is another term. You may hear a lot if you take SLS 490, but the most important thing to remember is reliability has to do with how consistent an instrument or a test is across different test takers or different raters in the case of a writing sample. And I included a picture of my dog, Ponce, because he is very reliable. And whenever I think of reliability, I think of my dog, because every time I come home, he's always happy to see me. It doesn't matter how long I've been away, or also he doesn't care what I smell like, or if I've had a hard day, he's happy to see me. He also reliably jumps on the bed in the evening and is there to sleep at night. And he very reliably expects his breakfast and dinner at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. respectively. So ideally we want an instrument that is reliable. Also, we hope to get an instrument or a test that is valid. Bailey would say that validity refers to the extent to which a test measures what it is supposed to measure. And ideally, a valid instrument would satisfy various requirements or would meet various aspects of validity, various types of validity. Face validity, for example, would refer to the extent to which a test appears to measure or seems like it's measuring what it's measuring. So for example, a reading test with high face validity would be a test in which the students are actually reading, because you would assume that any test of reading would engage students in doing the same, engage students in doing that task. Construct validity refers to how accurately or how well the test covers what we understand reading to be. So your construct validity is going to depend on your view of reading and how reading happens. But ideally, you would want various tasks on sort of a reading test that's measuring your global ability level at reading. You would want to make sure it covers different aspects of the reading process. So everything that is involved in reading. So not just the bottom-up processes, recognizing words and being able to connect them together, but also those top-down processes. Content validity refers to whether or not the test actually includes relevant content to what you are testing on. I won't say much about it here just because we're talking about reading, but for instance, if you were teaching a content-based course, for example, on American culture, and in your test you were looking to assess students' knowledge of American culture as well as their reading skills, ideally the reading passage included in your text would be related to American culture and not something else. Concurrent validity has to do with how well your test, how well your students' results on your test compare to the results that they would get from taking a similar test or a well-known test. For example, if I give a test of reading to my class, students are going to get different scores. If the next day I have all of my students take the reading section of the TOEFL test, I would expect the distribution of their scores to be similar to what happened on my reading test. In other words, if this top scoring student on my test was the lowest scoring student on the TOEFL reading test, my test likely would have a problem, right? So ideally, your measure could be compared to another measure that has been well researched and has been proven to discriminate well or to differentiate well among students or people taking the test. Predictive validity, for example, if you have a test that's part of a program and it's looking to place students in appropriate levels, hopefully, if your reading test is used to separate students into levels, the students that go into the higher levels, hopefully they really do have better reading skills. And so you'd only be able to analyze the predictive validity of your test if you went back and then looked at the students' reading level and the students in those higher levels. Consequential validity has to do with the effects of your tests on both teaching and learning. In language testing, this concept is often referred to as washback. Kind of sounds like backwash, but it has to do with washback. And basically, washback is the effect of testing on teaching and learning. A washback essentially is either positive or negative, maybe both. I ask here, what are some examples? You may have heard of the sort of standardized assessment drive. One negative effect or negative washback from the increase in number of standardized tests that students are taking in the United States is that sometimes teachers seem to adjust their instruction so where they're basically teaching students how to take this standardized test, which is not the goal of the individuals who created that standardized test, nor likely what the students or parents or even the teachers would want to be studying or learning in their class. An example of positive washback, however, would be the inclusion on the TOEFL and also on the SAT and GRE of actual writing assessment tasks where students or test takers have to write. So for a long time, writing was assessed, for example, just by answering multiple choice questions. There wasn't a lot of reading involved. So it was assessed through tests of vocabulary, through discrete items. However, with the inclusion of actual writing tasks on these large standardized assessments, more emphasis is being placed now in ESL and in other classrooms on actual writing. Hedgecock and Ferris say that feedback could be one of the best ways to promote positive washback. So any sort of formative instrument that you use and that gives students progress or gives students feedback on their progress toward goals can be very positive. And summative assessment, that usually consists of a score or a grade, and often these summative assessments are not returned to students. So for example, I'm thinking of final exams. However, ideally, even summative assessments would be returned to students, or the results of those assessments would be distributed so students could analyze their performance and their achievement, which would in turn help them to reflect on what they have learned and then sort of set them up to keep learning. Now, one commonly used method of assessing reading are comprehension questions. These comprehension questions are often included after a particular passage. And essentially, they're meant to check comprehension of the text or students' understanding of the text, possibly to facilitate comprehension, or simply to ensure that the learner reads the text. Okay? So they're widely used, but not as many teachers or researchers, I think, question why we use them as much as we do. And to illustrate my point, I'd like to present you with this particular passage. It's not a language that anyone knows because it's a made-up language, and this with some English grammar included, and some English articles you will see, and also some English prepositions. But the story here is called The Kin, and I'll just read the first 3 sentences for you. The kin is in the zab, the kin rafadig dan, the does is the zab of the kin. Now, you may have no idea what I just read, what kin means, what zab means, what raf or dan or does or sav. However, I'm 100% sure that you can all answer these comprehension questions correctly. So if I ask you, where is the kin? Well, just look at the first question, the first sentence, the kin is in the zab. So your answer would either be the kin is in the zab or just in the zab, even if you don't know what zab means. Again, for question 2, what did the kin raf? Looks like a dan. That's what he raft. Okay, and so you could answer it. So, are these questions assessing your comprehension of the text? Who knows? I mean, I think that they definitely assess your ability to pull out the important information you need to answer that question. But do you really understand what this text is saying? I don't know. I don't understand what it's saying either. So, okay. So, just some questions and food for thought is really to consider what these comprehension questions are telling us about our students' understanding of the text. And can we really be certain that our students have understood the text in the way that we would hope or that we would assume? So Nation, in a book of his, highlights some of the weaknesses of comprehension questions, and those would be that they're usually specific to a particular text. Sometimes these questions are answerable just from our personal experience and not just from having read the text. When we constantly include comprehension questions, we may be encouraging our students to focus more on getting the right answer rather than to focus on improving their language skills or on improving their reading skills. And finally, it takes a lot of time and effort to create really good multiple choice comprehension questions. And if you have taken SLS 490 or in it right now, you'll have a good understanding of all that is involved in that effort. So some general guidelines for when you go to create items for a particular reading test, or really any test, but since we're talking about reading, I'll use that as an example. First would be to embrace variety, particularly variety in response type. So if you are going to give your students either a diagnostic, a formative, or summative assessment of their reading ability, and you include only multiple choice questions, you are likely only accessing one type of knowledge. Okay? So the goal generally would be to embrace a variety of questions, and we're going to briefly look at some different options for our post-reading sort of comprehension exercises or our post-reading assessments. The other place would be to start with the text. So does the text itself, or does the text lend itself to a particular type of response or assessment? Finally, when you write your questions, you have to make sure your questions are not more complex or harder to understand than the actual text. Okay? Your exercises should not elicit knowledge or skills unrelated to reading. I'm hopefully going to have time to show you an example of this and the next time we meet, when I actually included a question on an important placement exam that really was more about students being able to subtract 2 numbers than on their comprehension of the text. Finally, your questions should ideally not focus on insignificant or very small details related to the material in a text. And best practice would say that the sequence of items should follow the order in which learners would process the text. So if you have a set of questions for students after reading, ideally the first question is not about the conclusion and the next question about something that happened in the middle of the text. You could go in order, both to help them and really to be in line with general recommendations for test development. Now, there are two main types of assessment tasks. The first type would be controlled response, and the second type, we call them constructed response. So controlled response types would include multiple choice, gap filling, matching, or true-false. For example, matching, multiple choice we all know. Matching would be when test takers have to match words or sentences to particular blanks in the passage. Okay? Some advantages of controlled response tasks would be that by requiring a single response, it is much easier to score the tests, and they're often seen as more objective. Also, that format is easily implemented via computer software. Multiple choice or true-false questions are also very familiar to many learners. Some disadvantages, however, are that controlled response questions really elicit only recognition knowledge. It's hard to assess deep comprehension or deep engagement with a particular text through matching or true-false questions. These controlled response type items also encourage guessing. They may lead test takers to focus on test-taking strategies rather than improving their literacy skills. And they're also very challenging to write. At least good multiple choice questions are very challenging to write. The other type of assessment task would be constructed response assessment tasks. Examples of these are short answer or extended response items. Short answer items would be when you provide a question to your students or test takers and they generally write between 1 to 2 sentences in response. An extended response would be something longer than 2 sentences, so possibly a paragraph, a page, or even a full essay. Some advantages of the constructed response types are that the learners actually have to do more with the text in a sense, and they have to demonstrate their ability to interpret certain parts of the task or their ability to engage with key themes from the text. Some disadvantages would be the huge amount of variation you get in learner responses. This sort of variation can, be managed by developing clear rubrics, and we're going to talk about rubrics when we get to the assessment of writing. I talked about it already, but some additional examples of constructed response types would be free recall tests. And essentially in this type of task, a test taker would read a passage in a short or a specific amount of time, and they would then need to report back in writing everything that they could remember about the text. So essentially writing a summary. Note-taking is also a possible response type, and outlining, as well as I mentioned earlier, the extended responses, which could be as much as an essay or a report or a paper, and summaries. At this point, we're going to conclude our discussion of assessing reading, and I think what better way for you to apply a number of the concepts that we've addressed in this lecture than to ask you to design a very short quiz, a set of tasks related to the content. So for this task, you're going to design a very short reading comprehension quiz or testlet based on one of these 3 texts. Not all of them, you choose. So either Hedgecock and Ferris chapter 9, the 13 pages mentioned, Aebersold and Field chapter 9, or the text that you have decided to use for your reading lesson plan. The advantage of using Hedgecock and Ferris or Aebersold and Field is likely that you've already read it and so could easily quickly go and design a few questions. The advantage to using the text that you have chosen for your reading lesson plan would be that you could actually include this assessment task as with your lesson plan. So essentially, by completing this asynchronous activity or completing the activity required for this asynchronous module, you'll also be contributing to your lesson plan. There is a rubric up on our website. I would suggest you read that rubric, and the rubric would direct you to include a variety of different task items, and you as the test developer, as the quiz developer, can decide whether or not you want to prepare this quiz to be presented in paper format or in an online format. So for example, Google Forms can be a great way to have a quiz or to present to create a testlet. And when you have students take that quiz or that test, the answers can actually be designed to be sent back to you. And if you have multiple choice or fill in the gap items, students could even find out immediately whether or not they were right. I'm looking to get a physical or electronic copy of your little testlet by Wednesday morning for class 8:29 a.m. on February 21st. We'll also be having our first 2 reading lesson plan workshops that day, and I very much look forward to seeing your great ideas. So I hope you have a nice weekend, a nice holiday on Monday, and I will see you soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.